You know what nobody tells you about workplace hierarchies? They're not really about competence. They're about proximity to power. And I learned that lesson the hard way when I watched a woman with zero qualifications become everyone's boss overnight. Not because she earned it, but because she was sleeping with the man who signed our paychecks. I'm going to tell you a story today that I've carried with me for nearly 20 years. It's about a moment when an entire office, good people, hard-working people, had to choose between their dignity and their paychecks. And what happened next taught me more about human psychology, group dynamics, and the price of silence than any textbook ever could. This isn't a story about heroes. It's about something more important. It's about ordinary people discovering the exact moment they couldn't stay quiet anymore. Where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. I always love knowing where these stories land, what corners of the world they reach, because what I'm about to share, it could have happened anywhere. It probably has.
Her name was Vanessa, and she walked into our office on a Tuesday morning in June wearing designer heels that clicked against the tile floor like a countdown. I'd been working at that marketing firm for 6 years. 6 years of climbing slowly, earning respect project by project, learning the industry from people who'd been doing it since before I was born. It was a mid-sized company, about 40 of us, and we all knew each other's rhythms. Who took their coffee black, who stayed late on Thursdays, who you could count on when a client lost their mind at 4:30 on a Friday. We were a functioning ecosystem. Imperfect, sure, but functional. Then Richard, our CEO, called an all-hands meeting. We gathered in the conference room, confused because these meetings usually came with advance notice, usually came with agendas printed on cream-colored paper that Richard's assistant distributed the day before. Richard stood at the head of the table, and Vanessa stood beside him. That's when I noticed his hand resting on the small of her back, not professionally, but possessively, the way you touch someone who belongs to you. "I want to introduce you all to Vanessa," he said, smiling in a way that made my stomach tighten. "She'll be joining us as Director of Operations, effective immediately." Director of Operations. A position that hadn't existed yesterday, a title that suddenly placed her above 3 department heads who'd been with the company for over a decade. The room went silent. Not the thoughtful kind of silence, the stunned kind. The kind that happens when everyone's brain is trying to process information that doesn't compute. Someone asked about her background. Richard's answer was vague, decorated with words like fresh perspective and innovative approach and exactly what we need to scale. He didn't mention her degree because she didn't have one relevant to our industry. He didn't mention her experience because she'd been working as a lifestyle blogger before this. I watched faces around that table. I watched people I respected trying to rearrange their expressions into something neutral, something that wouldn't cost them their jobs. I watched them swallow questions they wanted to ask. Have you ever been in a room where everyone knows the truth, but nobody can say it out loud? It's suffocating. The air gets thick with all those unspoken words. After the meeting, we scattered back to our desks like startled birds. Nobody said anything directly, but the break room became a confessional for the next 3 days. Whispered conversations, raised eyebrows, that particular brand of office cynicism that comes from watching merit get thrown out the window.
But here's what I learned about human nature during that time. Most people can swallow injustice if it doesn't directly affect their daily life. They'll complain, sure. They'll roll their eyes and make jokes, but they'll adapt. They'll rationalize. They'll tell themselves it's not worth the fight. We might have stayed in that uncomfortable equilibrium forever, resentful but compliant, bitter but employed. Then Vanessa scheduled her first department meeting. It was a Thursday afternoon. She'd been there less than a week, still learning people's names, still figuring out where the bathroom was. She gathered the entire operations team, about 15 of us, into the large conference room. She had a presentation prepared, PowerPoint slides with corporate stock photos and bullet points. I remember thinking how strange it was that she'd spent time making slides before she'd spent time understanding what we actually did. She talked about synergy and optimization and leveraging core competencies, all the meaningless language people use when they don't actually know what they're talking about. We sat there, patient, waiting for the real content. Then she got to slide 7. Moving forward, she said, her voice trying for authority, but landing somewhere near condescension. I'll need everyone to CC me on all client emails, every single one. I need to understand the full scope of communication happening with our accounts. The room shifted. It was subtle, a few people glancing at each other, someone adjusting in their chair, but I felt it, that collective intake of breath. Marcus, our senior account manager, spoke up first. He was in his 50s, had been managing major clients since before some of us graduated high school. Every email? He asked. That could be hundreds per day across the team. Every email, Vanessa confirmed. I can't effectively oversee operations if I'm not in the loop. But we have project management systems, said Jennifer, who ran our creative team. Everything's documented there. Client communications, timelines, deliverables. I prefer email, Vanessa interrupted. It's more immediate. What she was really saying, of course, was that she wanted control. She wanted surveillance. She wanted to insert herself into every conversation, every decision, every relationship we'd spent years building with our clients. But there was something else happening beneath that request, something more psychologically insidious. She was establishing dominance. She was making us prove our work to her, making us accountable to someone who didn't understand what we did. She was turning trusted professionals into children who needed permission. And here's what most people don't understand about workplace power dynamics. It's rarely the big, dramatic moments that break people. It's the small indignities, the death by 1,000 cuts, the constant message that you're not trusted, not valued, not competent.
I watched Marcus's jaw tighten, watched Jennifer's fingers drum against her notepad, watched the room calculate the cost of compliance. That's going to slow everything down, Marcus said carefully. Client relationships depend on quick response times. If we have to loop in another layer of approval—
I'm not approving anything, Vanessa said, her voice sharper now. I'm simply staying informed, unless you have something to hide. There it was, the implied threat, the suggestion that resistance meant guilt. The meeting ended badly. People left quietly, but I could see it in their faces, that particular expression that comes from being disrespected by someone who hasn't earned the right to demand your respect. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about something I'd learned years ago in my psychology practice. Human beings have a deeply ingrained need for fairness. It's not just about justice in the abstract. It's wired into our neural architecture. When we perceive unfairness, especially in hierarchical relationships, our brains respond similarly to physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex lights up. Stress hormones flood our system. We're not built to simply accept being diminished. By Friday morning, I'd heard from 4 different people. Everyone was furious. Everyone felt insulted. But everyone was also scared. Scared of losing their job. Scared of being targeted. Scared of what resistance might cost them. Just do what she asks,
one colleague told me. It's not worth fighting. But I kept thinking about that meeting, about the way Vanessa had looked at us, not as experienced professionals, but as obstacles to her authority, about the way Richard had handed her power she hadn't earned, consequences be damned. And I kept thinking about what happens when good people stay silent, what it does to them, what it does to their sense of self. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find out exactly what happens when silence becomes more painful than speaking up.
The rebellion started with something so small I almost missed it. Monday morning, Marcus sent out a client email. It was routine, confirming a meeting time, nothing sensitive or controversial, and he didn't CC Vanessa. I noticed because I was hyper-aware by then, watching to see how people would respond to her demands. Would we comply? Would we normalize this new reality? Would we just accept it? An hour later, Vanessa responded to the thread, despite not being included, with a message that made my blood pressure spike. Please remember our new communication protocol. All client emails should include me moving forward. She'd been monitoring our emails somehow. Maybe she'd asked IT for access. Maybe Richard had given her administrative privileges. Either way, the message was clear. I'm watching. Marcus didn't respond to her message, but 20 minutes later, he sent another client email, again without CCing Vanessa. I realized what he was doing. He was testing the boundary, seeing what would happen, seeing if she'd escalate. She did. By Tuesday afternoon, Vanessa had scheduled individual meetings with everyone who hadn't been following protocol. She called them alignment conversations. The rest of us called them what they were: threats. I got my meeting invitation at 4 p.m. Time slot: tomorrow, 9 a.m. Subject line: Communication Standards Discussion. That night, I talked to my husband about it, about whether I should just comply, just make my life easier, about whether this was really the hill I wanted to die on. What bothers you more? Following her rule, or what it means if you do? That question kept me up again, because he was right. This wasn't really about email protocols. It was about something deeper. It was about whether we were willing to let someone treat us like we couldn't be trusted, whether we were willing to let incompetence supervise competence, whether we were willing to participate in our own diminishment. I want you to think about a time in your own life when someone asked you to compromise your dignity. Maybe it was small, maybe it seemed insignificant, but something in you resisted. Something said, not this, not today. That's where I was. My meeting with Vanessa was worse than I expected. She had a printed spreadsheet of my emails. She'd actually gone through and tracked every client communication I'd sent since she arrived, highlighting the ones that didn't include her. I see a pattern here, she said, tapping the paper with her pen. You're not following the protocol we discussed. I didn't realize it was mandatory, I said carefully. You framed it as a preference. It's a requirement, she said, and I need to know I can count on you to be a team player. Team player, that phrase that always means do what I want without questioning. Can I ask what you're looking for in these emails? What specific concern you're trying to address?
She leaned back in her chair, and I saw something flicker across her face. Not anger, exactly, but something harder to name. Insecurity, maybe. The defensiveness of someone who knows they're in over their head. I'm trying to ensure quality control, she said. We have quality control measures, I replied. We have review processes, approval chains, client feedback systems. I need visibility, she interrupted. That's not negotiable. We stared at each other across that desk, and I understood something crucial. This wasn't about improving operations. This was about her needing to prove to herself, to Richard, to all of us, that she deserved to be there. And she decided the way to prove it was by controlling us. I left that meeting shaking, not with fear, with rage. The kind of rage that comes from being disrespected by someone who hasn't earned your respect. Here's what I know about anger from decades of working with people. It's not always destructive. Sometimes anger is clarity. Sometimes it's your psyche telling you that something is wrong, that a boundary has been violated, that you need to act. Healthy anger says, "This is not okay, and I won't pretend it is." By Wednesday, something had shifted in the office. People were talking more openly. The whispers had become conversations. Someone had created a private Slack channel, not for anything explicit, just a place where people could vent without fear of Vanessa seeing. The channel was called Operations Reality Check. Within 2 hours, 30 people had joined. I read through the messages, people sharing their frustration, people sharing stories of competent colleagues who'd been undermined by unqualified managers, people expressing something I recognized immediately. They were tired of pretending. That afternoon, Marcus did something extraordinary. He sent a company-wide email, not about Vanessa directly, but about the value of trust in professional relationships, about how micromanagement destroys morale, about how the best teams are built on autonomy and mutual respect. It was professional, it was measured, but everyone knew what he was really saying. Vanessa responded within minutes, scheduling an emergency department meeting for the next morning, mandatory attendance. That night, I barely slept again. I kept thinking about the psychology of group dynamics, about what I'd studied years ago regarding collective action and social courage. Here's what most people don't understand. Rebellion rarely starts with a leader. It starts with permission. It starts when one person breaks the silence, and suddenly everyone realizes they're not alone in their frustration. Marcus had given us permission. His email had said, "It's okay to name this problem. It's okay to resist." The meeting Thursday morning was tense. Vanessa stood at the front of the room, visibly agitated. Richard sat beside her, the first time he'd attended one of her meetings. That's when I knew this had escalated beyond her control. It's come to my attention that some people are having trouble adjusting to new operational standards. I want to make something clear. These standards are not optional. They're not suggestions. And if people can't get on board, we need to have serious conversations about fit. Fit, the word companies use when they mean comply or leave. The room was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. This wasn't shock or confusion. This was calculation. This was 15 people simultaneously deciding whether they were willing to lose their jobs over principle. Jennifer spoke first. "Can I ask what problem we're solving? Because from where I'm sitting, client relationships are strong, projects are on track, and the only thing that's changed is an additional administrative burden that's slowing down our response times. The problem is that I can't manage what I can't see." Then maybe the question isn't about visibility. Maybe it's about trust. The air changed. You could feel it. That moment when everything gets real, when polite pretense evaporates and truth walks into the room uninvited.
That was 18 years ago. I've thought about it countless times since, about what that moment taught me about human nature, about courage, about the cost of silence and the cost of speaking. Here's what I learned, what I want you to understand. Dignity is not negotiable. Not for a paycheck, not for security, not for convenience. When you compromise your dignity, you don't just lose that moment, you lose a piece of yourself. You train your brain to accept diminishment. You teach yourself that you're not worth defending.
And the psychological cost of that is profound. I've sat with hundreds of people over my career who regretted staying silent when they should have spoken, who regretted complying when they should have resisted. The regret they carried wasn't about losing a job or facing consequences. It was about losing respect for themselves. But I've never, not once, sat with someone who regretted standing up for their dignity, even when it cost them something. Let me be clear. I'm not suggesting everyone should quit their job over every frustration. I'm not advocating reckless resistance or martyrdom. Real life is complicated. People have bills to pay, families to support, limited options. But there's a difference between strategic compromise and complete capitulation. There's a difference between choosing your battles and surrendering your voice. What happened in that office wasn't about email protocols. It was about whether we would participate in normalizing dysfunction, whether we would let someone treat us badly just because they had a title and we didn't. And here's what I learned about collective action that I've seen proven again and again. Change almost never comes from one person alone. It comes from someone breaking the silence and then others realizing they have permission to speak too. Marcus's email didn't start the rebellion, but it gave everyone else courage to join. My comment in that meeting didn't solve the problem, but it showed others they weren't alone in their frustration. That's how social courage works. It's contagious. One person's willingness to risk something makes it easier for the next person to risk something too. But it requires that first person, that first moment of refusal to pretend everything is fine. Have you been in a situation where you knew something was wrong but stayed silent? Maybe it was at work. Maybe it was in a relationship. Maybe it was in your family. Most of us have been there. Most of us have felt that internal conflict between safety and integrity. I want you to know, choosing safety isn't always wrong. Sometimes it's wise. Sometimes it's necessary. But if you find yourself repeatedly choosing silence over dignity, repeatedly accepting treatment you know is wrong, that's worth examining. Because here's what happens psychologically when we consistently compromise our values. We develop what's called cognitive dissonance. Our actions don't match our beliefs, and that creates internal tension. To resolve it, we either change our actions or change our beliefs. And too often, people change their beliefs. They convince themselves that what's happening isn't really that bad. They rationalize, they minimize. They adapt to dysfunction until it feels normal. That's how good people end up tolerating terrible situations, not because they're weak, but because the human brain is incredibly good at protecting itself from uncomfortable truths. The antidote is consciousness, awareness, naming what's happening instead of pretending it isn't.
After Vanessa left, our office slowly returned to normal. But normal felt different. We'd learned something about ourselves, both individually and collectively. We'd learned that we were willing to risk something for dignity, that we were willing to support each other, that we were stronger together than apart. Several people told me later that it was the first time in their careers they'd spoken up against someone in power, that they'd always believed they couldn't, that they'd be punished or fired or destroyed. And they were surprised, shocked even, to discover that standing up didn't destroy them, it strengthened them. That's the paradox of courage. We think it makes us vulnerable, but it actually makes us more resilient. Because when you know you're capable of defending yourself, when you know you won't accept mistreatment, you become harder to break. I left that company eventually, not because of what happened, but because I'd learned I wanted something different. I wanted to work with people who valued respect and competence over hierarchy and control. And once you know what you won't accept, it gets easier to pursue what you will. But I took something invaluable from that experience. Proof that ordinary people, faced with unfairness, will eventually reach a breaking point. Will eventually say, no more,
Not today. And that when they do, they're often surprised to discover they were never as alone as they thought. If you're in a situation right now where you're being asked to compromise your dignity, where you're being diminished or disrespected or controlled by someone who hasn't earned that power, I want you to know you're not crazy. That internal voice telling you something is wrong, listen to it. You don't have to quit tomorrow. You don't have to make a dramatic gesture. But you can start by refusing to pretend, by naming what's happening, even just to yourself, by finding others who see what you see, by setting small boundaries and seeing what happens. Because here's what I've learned after decades of listening to people's stories. The regrets that haunt us aren't usually about the risks we took. They're about the moments we stayed silent when we should have spoken, the times we accepted less than we deserved, the instances when we let someone else define our worth. Dignity is not something someone can give you. It's not something that comes with a promotion or a title or someone else's approval. It's something you claim, something you defend, something you refuse to surrender, even when the cost is high. That woman who walked into our office with designer heels and unearned authority, she taught me more about human nature than she ever intended. She showed me how insecurity manifests as control, how proximity to power gets confused with competence, how systems can be broken when they prioritize relationships over merit. But more importantly, she showed me what happens when people remember their worth, when they decide that cooperation has limits, when they choose dignity over convenience. The office rebellion wasn't violent, it wasn't dramatic. It was just a group of people saying collectively, we deserve better than this, and we're not going to pretend we don't. That's the lesson. That's what I want you to remember. You deserve better. You always have. And you don't need anyone's permission to believe that. The question is, what are you willing to do about it? Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to choose between your dignity and your security? What did you choose? And how did it change you? I read every comment. I want to hear your story. Because these stories, they're how we learn. They're how we remember we're not alone. They're how we give each other courage to stand up the next time something isn't right. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And thank you for being willing to think about the hard questions. The ones without easy answers. The ones that ask something of us. That's how we grow. That's how we become who we're meant to be. Until next time, take care of yourself. And remember, you're worth defending.